The night my son-in-law told me to pack my things, he was eating my food. That's the part I still can't shake even now. He was sitting at my kitchen table. The table I'd had for 19 years. The one my wife and I bought at an estate sale in Knoxville, when we were still young enough to think second-hand furniture was charming. And he was eating leftover pot roast I'd made the day before, eating it straight from the container, cold, standing at the counter when I walked in. Then he sat down at my table, pulled out a chair like it was already his. My daughter came in behind me. She wouldn't look at me directly. That was the first sign something was wrong. She has her mother's eyes, and when she's about to say something she doesn't want to say, she looks slightly to the left of you, like she's reading something written just past your shoulder. "Dad," she said, "we need to talk about the house." I was 63 years old. I'd lived in that house for 22 years. I'd replaced the water heater twice, rebuilt the back deck myself, planted the oak tree in the front yard that was now taller than the roof. My name was on the deed. I paid the mortgage through the company account my late wife and I had set up together before she passed, 8 years earlier. I set my keys on the counter. "What about it?" I said. "Her husband. I'll call him my son-in-law, because that's technically what he was, even if the word always felt like a bad fit," leaned back in the chair and crossed his arms. He was 31. He sold insurance, not the kind of insurance that requires a lot of skill, just the kind that requires a phone and the script and a willingness to call people during dinner. He had that particular confidence of someone who had never been truly wrong about anything because he had never truly been tested. "We've been thinking," my daughter said, "about space, about what makes sense long term." I waited. "The house is big," she said, "and you're here alone. And she glanced at her husband. "We need more room. The baby's coming in April. We thought maybe you could find somewhere else," my son-in-law said. Flat. No cushion on it. Just the words. I looked at him for a long moment, then at my daughter. She was looking slightly past my shoulder again. I want to be honest about what happened inside me in that moment. I expected to feel anger. I'd seen enough of my friends go through things, divorces, estrangements, business betrayals, and they always described the initial moment as hot. A flash, something that moved fast. What I felt was cold, not the cold of shock, the cold of something settling, like a window opening in November, and the temperature in the room just quietly dropping until everything is still. I asked if they meant temporarily. My son-in-law said they meant permanently. My daughter said, "Dad, you know we love you, but we need to build our own life." I had been paying half their rent for 2 years. Their previous apartment, the one before they moved in with me just temporarily, just until they got on their feet. That rent had come partly from me too, every month, quietly, because my daughter asked me not to make a big deal of it, and I didn't. I didn't say any of that. I thought about it, standing there in my own kitchen, but I didn't say it. Instead, I said, "I'll need a few weeks." My son-in-law said they were hoping for sooner. They'd already looked at cribs. That night I called my attorney. Not first thing in the morning. That night at 9:15, because I had his cell from when he helped me settle my wife's estate, and he'd told me to use it if I ever needed to. His name was Pete. He was 66, semi-retired, and he answered on the third ring. I told him what happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The house is yours outright." I said yes. "Paid off 4 years ago," he said. "Then they can't make you leave." I said I knew that. He said, "So why are you calling me?" I thought about it. I said, "Because I want to know what I'm walking into before I decide what to do." He told me to come in Monday. We'd look at everything, my will, any financial entanglements with my daughter, the company accounts, all of it. He said, "If you're thinking about leaving on your own terms, you want to make sure your terms are actually yours." That was good advice. I should say that clearly, because the comments on things like this, stories like mine, always include people who are furious that the man didn't march into a bank the next morning, didn't change every lock, didn't fight back immediately and loudly. I understand that instinct. I felt it too, watching other people's stories unfold, but I was 63 years old. I had a business I'd spent 30 years building. I had accounts my daughter had signatory access to, because I'd added her during a health scare 3 years earlier, and I had a grandchild coming in April that I already loved before they'd drawn a breath. Loud and fast wasn't the move. It never is, when there's something real to protect. I slept in the house that night. My house. I made coffee in the morning the way I always made it. Too strong in the old percolator my wife insisted on keeping even when drip machines were cheaper. And I sat on the back deck and looked at the yard I'd maintained for 2 decades. The garden beds my wife had planted were still there. I kept them up because I couldn't bring myself not to. Monday I met with Pete. We spent 3 hours going through everything. The first thing we did was remove my daughter from the company account. Not vindictively, practically. Pete explained it clearly. If something happened and there was a dispute, a joint account is a liability. We moved everything to a new account in my name only. We changed the signatory on the business checks. We made sure the deed on the house reflected exactly what it should. Then I thought about what I actually wanted. I could stay in the house. Legally, easily, I could stay. I could have walked back in that night and told my son-in-law to find a hotel. Would have been within my rights. But here's what nobody tells you about being right. Sometimes being right and staying put costs you more than leaving cleanly. My daughter was having a baby. My son-in-law was exactly who he had always been. I had just, for years, been too polite to see it clearly. Staying meant daily friction. Staying meant watching my daughter navigate between her husband and her father every single morning. Staying meant the baby came into a house full of that. I didn't want that for the baby. I found a furnished apartment in a complex about 12 minutes from the house. 2 bedrooms, 2nd floor, a small balcony that faced west. The complex was called Ridgemont, which sounded more impressive than it was. It was clean and quiet and had a laundry room on every floor, which at 63 I appreciated more than I would have expected. I moved on a Saturday. My neighbor from 3 houses down, a retired electrician named Harold, came with his pickup and helped me load the things I was taking. My toolbox, my tools from the workshop, my wife's recipe binder, the kitchen table, the percolator, the 2 armchairs from the living room that had been ours before anything in that house had been theirs. My daughter watched from the doorway. She looked like she wanted to say something but didn't. My son-in-law wasn't home. Harold didn't ask me much. That was the right call. He just loaded things and drove and helped me carry. And when we were done, he said, "You need anything, you call." Then he went home. I sat in the empty apartment that night, and I won't pretend it was fine. It wasn't fine. I was 63 years old, sitting on one of my own armchairs, in a furnished apartment with a fold-out couch and a balcony that looked out over a parking lot. My wife had been gone 8 years. My daughter had made her choice, and the choice had a name and sold insurance. I let myself feel that one night. I've always believed that you get one night to sit with it, and then you have to decide what you're building. The next morning, I drove to the office. I had started my business in 1991. Commercial property maintenance. Not glamorous, but essential. When a shopping center's HVAC goes down or a medical building's parking lot needs resurfacing, someone has to handle it. I built contracts slowly, carefully, over 30 years. By the time I was sitting in that apartment, I had a crew of 14 full-time and a client list that included 6 of the largest commercial landlords in the county. My daughter had worked with me for 4 years. I'd brought her in because she asked to learn the business, and she was smart, genuinely smart, better with the financials than I'd ever been. But after the apartment incident, when I thought about it honestly, I realized she'd been sharing information with her husband for at least 2 years. Not proprietary, nothing that hurt me legally, but he knew which clients were unhappy, which contracts were up for renewal. He'd once mentioned, almost casually, that he'd spoken to a competitor of mine at a networking event. I'd thought nothing of it then. I thought about it now. I restructured quietly, changed the contract templates, moved our client database to a new system my IT person set up with different access credentials. My daughter still had her role. I didn't fire her. That's not what this was. But her access was narrowed to what her role actually required. I didn't announce it. I just did it. She noticed after 3 weeks. She called me and asked why she couldn't access the renewal pipeline anymore. I said, "That's been moved to operations. Anything you need from there you can request through Marcus." Marcus was my operations manager, 28 years with me. Loyal the way only someone who's been treated fairly for a long time knows how to be loyal. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you doing this because of the house?" I said, "I'm doing it because it makes operational sense." She didn't push it further. The first year in the apartment was the hardest. Not because of the apartment itself. I made it mine faster than I expected. I hung my wife's photographs. I bought a proper coffee maker, though I kept the percolator too. I started walking every morning, something I hadn't done in years, down along the greenway by the river that runs through the edge of town. At 63 I was still healthy, still working full days, still the person who showed up first and left last. But the holidays were hard. Thanksgiving I was invited to my former house, and I went because the baby had been born in April, a boy, and I would not let anything keep me from that child. I sat at a table that used to be mine, in a house that used to be mine, and my son-in-law carved the turkey like a man who had always been master of that domain. I held my grandson, and I did not say a word about any of it. Some battles you don't fight at the table, you fight them in the years that follow. The second year I started getting calls, not from my daughter, from former colleagues of my son-in-law. It turned out he had left his insurance job and started a property management consulting firm. Nothing that competed with me directly, but adjacent enough that some of my clients had been contacted by him. Not with my information, or nothing I could prove, but the timing was notable. 2 of my clients mentioned it to me directly. One asked me, point blank, if I knew my son-in-law was calling on them. I said I was aware they were in the same space. I didn't make it dramatic. I just made sure my service was tighter than it had ever been. I hired a client relations coordinator for the first time in 30 years of business, a woman named Faye, sharp as a tack, who did nothing but maintain relationships with our top 20 accounts. Every renewal that year came in at or above the previous rate. No client left. 2 new ones signed. My son-in-law's consulting firm was quiet within 18 months. I know this because small markets talk. You don't have to do anything. You just have to be good enough for long enough, and people notice on their own. The third year, my daughter called me out of the blue on a Tuesday afternoon. She said she wanted to have lunch. Just the 2 of us. We met at a diner we'd gone to when she was in high school. She ordered the same thing she always ordered, a BLT with extra bacon, which her mother would have called a cardiac event, waiting to happen. I ordered coffee and the soup of the day, which was chicken noodle and not as good as mine. She was quiet for a while after we ordered. Then she said, "Things aren't great." I waited. She said her husband's business hadn't worked out the way they'd hoped. She said the house, my house, though neither of us called it that, was more expensive to maintain than they'd expected. She said they'd had to take out a home equity line, which she delivered like information, not like an apology. I looked at my coffee. She said, "I want to come back to work." Full excess the way it was. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the night I sat in a furnished apartment with a fold-out couch. I thought about Harold and his pickup truck. I thought about my wife's recipe binder and the garden beds I'd tended for 8 years out of something between love and habit. I said, "The role I have available is different from what you had before." She asked what that meant. I said, "It means you'd be reporting to Marcus. You'd have a defined scope. You'd earn your access back the same way anyone earns it, by doing the work." Her chin moved a little, not a lot. I said, "I love you. That's not the question. The question is whether you want to work in a real job with real accountability, or whether you want a favor, because I've done favors, and I've found they don't hold." She looked at her BLT for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." She started the following Monday. She reported to Marcus. She did the work. It took about 4 months before the dynamic between us felt something close to normal. Not the old normal. Not the one where I was her father who also happened to sign her checks and look the other way at certain things. A new normal. More honest in some ways. less comfortable in others. Her husband I saw at family events. He was cordial. I was cordial. We had nothing to say to each other, and we'd both made peace with that. My grandson was walking by then. He called me Pop. The first time he said it, just walked up to me in what had been my living room and held his arms up and said, "Pop, I had to leave the room for a moment." Just a minute. I walked into the kitchen that used to be mine and stood at the window that looked out over the garden beds. And I thought about all the years in between. Then I went back out and picked him up. About 2 years ago, I was at a contractor's breakfast, one of those early morning chamber events with bad eggs and good connections, and a man I didn't know came up and introduced himself. He said he'd heard of my company, said a mutual contact had mentioned my name specifically when he was looking for a maintenance partner for a new development going up across town. 40-unit mixed-use building, 5-year contract minimum. We signed the following month. My daughter handles the account. She's the one who put together the proposal. She did it without being asked, stayed late 3 nights to get the numbers right, and when she presented it to me, I told her it was the best proposal I'd seen come out of this office in years. I meant it. I don't know exactly when my son-in-law found out about the contract, but I know that around that time my daughter mentioned, quietly, at the end of a regular Tuesday check-in, that he had asked if there was any possibility of him consulting for us. She said she told him that wasn't something she could speak to. She said it the way you say something you've thought about carefully, with both hands. Not angry, not satisfied, just clear. I told her she'd answered correctly. I still live in the apartment at Ridgemont. I've thought about buying something. There's a small place on the east side of town, good bones, needs work, the kind of project I would have loved at 50. But I'm 67 now, and the apartment suits me. I walk the Greenway most mornings. I keep the percolator on the counter, even though I also have the good coffee maker. I have my wife's photographs on the wall and the recipe binder on the kitchen shelf. And on Sunday evenings I sometimes cook from it. The pot roast, usually. It comes out different than hers. Not worse, just different. My grandson comes over on alternating Saturdays. We watch whatever he wants, which is currently anything involving trucks, so most Saturdays we watch a lot of trucks. He sits in what has become his chair, one of the armchairs I took from the house, with his feet sticking straight out because he's not big enough to reach the edge, and he narrates the trucks to me like I might not have noticed them. I notice them. I notice all of it. Last spring my daughter called me after a long day and we talked for almost 2 hours about nothing important. Work. The baby's preschool. A bird that had built a nest in the oak tree in the front yard. My oak tree. The one I'd planted when it was smaller than my arm. At some point she got quiet in that way she has. The one I've known since she was small. And she said, "I think about what happened a lot. When we asked you to..." She stopped. Started again. "I think we made a mistake." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "There it is." She asked what that meant. I said nothing. Just that I've been waiting a while for that sentence. She laughed a little. Not a lot. The kind of laugh that isn't entirely about being amused. I said, "We're okay." She said, "Are we?" I thought about the Greenway in the morning light. I thought about Harold and his pickup, and Pete answering the phone at 9:15, and Marcus, who has been loyal the way only someone treated fairly knows how to be loyal, the way only someone treated fairly knows how to be loyal. I thought about my grandson in the armchair with his feet sticking out, narrating trucks. I said, "Yeah, we're okay." And I meant it. Not as forgiveness granted from a height, not as something I had to perform. I meant it the way you mean something when you've had enough years to see the whole shape of it. When the thing that almost broke you turned out to be the thing that showed you what you were actually made of. I still have the company. I still walk the Greenway. I still make the coffee too strong, and every Saturday my grandson comes over and sits in his chair and tells me about the trucks, and I listen like there's nowhere else in the world I need to be. Because there isn't. There's a thing I've come to believe. Somewhere between the night I sat alone in that Ridgemont apartment, and the Saturday my grandson called me Pop for the first time. The way you respond to being wronged tells you more about yourself than the wrong ever could. I didn't respond perfectly. I want to be honest about that. There were nights I replayed that kitchen scene, my son-in-law at my table, eating my food, telling me to leave, and felt something that wasn't clean or quiet. But I didn't act from that place. That's the part that mattered. Not that I didn't feel it, that I chose what to do with it. When I called Pete that night at 9:15, I wasn't calling out of panic. I was calling because I understood, even in the worst of it, that clarity was more useful than anger. That's something 30 years of running a business teaches you. Or it teaches you nothing and you lose the business. You learn to slow down inside the emergency. You learn to ask what you actually know before you decide what to do. I knew the house was mine. I knew my accounts were exposed. I knew my daughter had made a choice, and that her husband had shaped that choice, and that neither of those facts changed what I needed to do next. So I acted on what I knew, quietly and without announcement, and I protected what I'd spent a lifetime building. That wasn't coldness. It was the kind of clear-headedness that only comes when you've lived long enough to understand that how you handle a bad moment is part of your character, maybe the most visible part. Marcus saw it. Pete saw it. Harold, who just showed up with his pickup and didn't ask questions, saw it in the way that people who've lived decent lives recognize decency in each other without having to name it. My daughter came back, not immediately and not because I made it easy, but because she is fundamentally a good person who made a bad decision under the influence of someone who wasn't. I gave her a real job with real accountability, and she rose to it. That took something from both of us. From her, the willingness to start over inside a relationship that had been damaged. From me, the willingness to let her, without making her pay for it indefinitely. Holding a grudge would have been simpler. Letting her earn her way back required me to actually believe that people can do better than their worst moment. I do believe that. You have to, at 67, or you end up alone with nothing but your righteousness to keep you warm. The thing about what happened with my son-in-law's consulting firm, the way it quietly collapsed while my contracts held, is that I didn't engineer that. I just kept doing the work. I kept showing up. I hired Faye. I tightened the systems. I made sure every client felt like they were the only client. What happened to him happened because quality compounds the same way damage does. You can't build something real on shortcuts and other people's information. Eventually, the foundation shows. I think about my wife sometimes, in the mornings on the Greenway. She would have handled all of it better than me. She had a way of seeing what mattered without getting tangled in what didn't, a kind of moral clarity that wasn't harsh, just steady. I try to carry some of that. Some days I do better than others. My grandson sits in that armchair every Saturday with his feet sticking out, and he doesn't know any of this story. He just knows Pop shows up, and the apartment smells like coffee, and there's always something worth watching if you look for it. That's enough. That's more than enough.